So good afternoon, everybody. Folks will drift in, but we are going to take the opportunity, hey George, to kick off our spring tech talks with our very own Jose Diaz-Gonzalez. Jose was part of the first class of Seidenberg scholars and came all the way up from North Carolina to join us. And Jose showed up on campus already very talented guy, taught himself to code, had a really good mentor as a AP computer science teacher in high school, and he was ready to rock and roll when he showed up on campus, and had a lot of adventures along the way. And he began his career with a company you've heard of, SeatGeek, and part of the engineering team that got that company up and moving forward, and a hot company to watch. And like many of us, sometimes you need to leave home for a while, and Jose left for another position, and wound up coming back home to SeatGeek, and we're particularly thrilled that he takes some time to be with us this afternoon. So it's just going to be a very loose conversation. Ask questions. Jose is one of the really, really talented people in the technology business, gifted programmer, and we've all learned a lot from him, and glad you could be with us. So how are you holding up here in pandemic land, Professor Gonzalez?
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of prior to the pandemic, a lot of my work at my previous job, at least, I left there recently in October, but my previous job, I was doing a lot of traveling for sales. I was doing sales engineering, so I'd go on site with a customer, kind of learn about their problem, figure out how to basically sell them our solution, but then also bridge what they already have with what we had. And that kind of literally all went away. I think the last scheduled travel I had was for Air Canada. They had this big integration that they wanted to do on Azure for their platform, their data visualization platform. And I had been for a while saying, "Oh, I don't want to go up to Canada. It's really cold. Let me just push off buying the flights." And then the day I was going to buy the flights, they closed the borders. So it's been interesting, transitioning from you're traveling every other week. I literally had been in my apartment for maybe 3 weeks out of 6 months, to you're stuck and not really doing anything. So that's been an interesting transition. I think the biggest thing has been I finally have a lot of time to spend on all of the random stuff that I've acquired over the years. So video games and little toys that I want to put together, or electronics that I have, or even just literally cleaning my apartment. So
that's great. And I want to talk to you about that a little bit. Projects. Developers are usually working on projects, and you've always had multiple things going on that you're interested in, not always programming stuff and technology stuff, but how do you pick a project, and what advice would you give these folks in terms of building their own experience, their own portfolios, in finding cool things to work on? They're going to help them find work and get better at what they do.
yeah, I've had this conversation a lot with people who want to get into programming, but are I don't want to say stuck, but very much entrenched in an existing field, right? So they're chemists, or they're doctors, or they work at a bar, or really anything, but they want to break into programming. And I think the biggest bit of advice I have is to find a problem that you have that seems like this is solvable, this is automatable. I can do this and not have to waste 30 minutes of my day, right? Or an hour, or whatever it is, and then just work on that problem. For me, I end up going into depth for a lot of my projects, right? So I'll start at a very high level, I need to fix this one thing, right? Maybe it's work related, or maybe it's something personal, and then I'll keep going down until I realize, okay, I've spent enough time digging into this hole. Let me start here. Let me build something that works at this level, and then move back up the stack. The biggest thing I think I have struggled with is concentrating and not moving between a ton of different projects. So just keeping focused on like, here's the problem I want to solve. I'm too far away from my problem. Maybe step back a bit and like go back to my original problem. I think that's probably the most important.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting thing. And how can people connect with these projects? I mean, you, for example, have this, I mean, you have a global network of people, mostly tech people, but some of them that like your music or your boxed rosé. But you've connected with this great support network online. And I've seen you influence, other Seidenberg folks in being able to do that. What advice do you have about how to get started for these folks? How can they find, like-minded online people? How can they find an open source project they might want to work on?
I think a lot of it comes down to something that like you're really, really passionate about. I have certain like technical problems I'm really interested in, one of which is like, how do you deploy code to a server and like spin something up? And that's cool. That's something that like I really enjoy. In a previous incarnation of my life, I really enjoyed video game development, and so I really focused on that and tried to figure out like what's the easiest way for me to get into this and like maybe make something that I can have on my iPhone. I think a lot of people are really, really like, a lot of folks who are maybe voices in the community are very open to, I don't want to say mentorship, but at least giving advice or pushing you along the right path. So I think it's very important to be open to reaching out and saying, hey, like I have this problem with this thing that you wrote, or it looks like you're working on this area. Do you have any advice for me? That sort of thing. I think a lot of people, you're working it within your own space. You maybe don't think that like what it is that you're doing is that important, or maybe you don't think that like it's worth asking. I think it's very important that you like speak out and make your voice heard in a sense, right? Whether that's because you're having a problem, you're probably not the only person having that problem. There's probably 10 other people. Or it's because you want some advice and you're going down some path that you don't know if like that's the correct one or not. I think a lot of folks, especially in the tech community, are really happy to sort of invite folks and make sure that they're, learning the right things or like headed down the correct path in terms of like what they're learning and, what they should not be learning, if
Yeah.
that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think it makes a lot of sense. And one of the things that's become really apparent to me and some of the faculty and staff and something Katie and Jill and Mel and I have been talking about is how do we help our students advocate for themselves? Because when I was 19 or 20 years old, I wasn't very good at asking for help. And I thought the world sort of should understand what I needed and bring it to my lap. And it doesn't usually work out that way. So how do you how do you advocate for yourself? How do you in this, particularly in the tech community, how do you, because again, a lot of these folks I think will thrive once they figure out how to start engaging. So
Yeah, I think so. There's a couple different things I want to say here. One is that I'm Hispanic. My parents are from El Salvador. For me, a lot of like breaking into the software development community is kind of has kind of been driven by the desire to make myself acknowledged, right? And in many cases, you might come into a situation where folks might, I don't know, might not be as interested in talking with you, or maybe don't recognize your skill set, or maybe think that you're just not even you're not in the right room, sort of thing. And so that's certainly something that I think in some sense you kind of have to deal with. I certainly have, and in some sense you kind of have to like just move on past it. My favorite story around this is actually I went to a conference in Portland. This is about, I want to say 6 years ago. It was a conference. There were lots of really, really well-known names. I think the keynote speaker was this guy, James Mickens from MIT. And he's a great speaker. If you ever have an opportunity to go see one of his talks, they're really, really entertaining, like very entertaining. He has a lot of like papers that he writes, and even the papers are like really, really hysterical, even and technical at the same time. But there were a lot of folks that were kind of zipping along. I didn't know anyone in that conference. I didn't know anyone in Portland. I didn't know anyone really in the tech space for that particular conference. And so I like literally like after the first day of the conference, I was like, well, now I'm in a city I've never been in. I don't know anyone, and I have no plans for the evening. So I just saw three people, or yeah, it was three people walking outside of the venue, and I was like, "Hey, do you mind if I join you for dinner? I see that you're at the conference, same as I am." I joined them for dinner. They were kind of, I think, hesitant, and I found out during the course of the night that one, they were the organizers of the conference. They were talking about very high level business stuff related to like not the conference, but like how their company is running. And they were meeting clients at the same time. So it's like, it was very nice of them to allow me to join. I made a ton of friends that night, actually. And actually ended up hiring one of them, and he's currently my manager at SeatGeek, actually. So I would say like just like putting yourself out there is the most important step, right? You might be shot down and people might say no, whatever. And then, that's too bad. But like you have to put yourself out for those opportunities. And if you don't, then you're going to miss them.
Yeah. No, I think that is really great advice. And it's not easy to do that. And you run the risk of being shot down, but the rewards are huge if you're able to do that. I want to, you brought up being, a Hispanic in a business that has not always been that welcoming to minority folks. We have so many successful Hispanic folks who have come through our doors and are out doing great things, but I don't know, PACE is not, some universities get the designation Hispanic serving institution if I think it's 40%, the institution should be 40% Hispanic. PACE is probably 22% Hispanic in the population. So out of 13,000 students, that's pretty considerable. Very, very, important demographic, and, fastest growing middle class in the United States is Hispanic. And, lots and lots of tech role models from Hispanic origins. What can we do? And maybe some of our Hispanic students on the call have some thoughts here. What can we do to, broaden that appeal and maybe we don't have a Hispanics in Tech chapter at Seidenberg. What can we do to be better at that?
Yeah, I
Be
think,
more inclusive and celebrating, the fact that we have this strong Hispanic legacy at the school.
yeah, it's pretty difficult for me to answer that, like something that will concretely work, because I don't know that. I've certainly been a part of attempts to make that work, both at work and
You have,
elsewhere.
yeah, yeah,
Um, I think part of it's just like making it so that folks feel comfortable, with their culture. I think a lot
mhm,
of like in my case, I typically was one of the like either the only or one of the very few Hispanics in the room, right? Well, that's been in high school and university, at my various jobs, at conferences, giving tech talks, that sort of thing. But I think being comfortable exposing your culture is super important. One of the things that like I remember, there's another guy, Vicente. You said that your middle name's Jose. There's another guy I work with. His name is Jose Lorenzo. He's part of the Cake PHP community. He's one of the core developers, and actually someone I like look up very very highly too. And we went to a conference once, and it happened to be his birthday during the conference, and his wife was there. She's actually a very talented flamenco dancer. I think she's from Spain, and he's from Argentina. And she did a flamenco dance in honor of his birthday, right, in front of the entire like conference, right. And I think that if he wasn't comfortable in his own skin, if he wasn't comfortable with like being Hispanic and his culture and his heritage, that would have been very difficult for him to sort of like swallow, right, in front of folks that he doesn't know and he doesn't understand,
yeah,
and maybe feels worried that he'll be judged for his background. And I think it's super critical that like the folks at Seidenberg feel comfortable with that. I don't know what that means, right? That could be a range of anything, right? That can be like literally just bringing up, here's events in a community that you might want to enjoy, right? Here's a bachata like social, right? Or here like we're celebrating certain you know very common Hispanic holidays, that sort of thing.
yeah,
It can be just as simple as just saying what's up, learning a little bit more about that person's culture, and sort of like remembering that for the next time something comes up. And I think that applies to not just Hispanic cultures, but like really anyone, right? Yeah, I think you have to be comfortable in your own skin and making sure that you can, talk about your culture and even be proud of that in front of a group of strangers, I think is really important.
Yeah, no, I think that's so true. And, I think one of the things I love about our community is that, we support and celebrate wherever you're from. If you're from Argentina or El Salvador, or Uruguay or Bulgaria or Israel or Russia or China and India, of course. And I love that about us. But, there's tremendous resource. There are these Hispanic professional organizations that our students should have access to, that we need to do a better job to make sure that those opportunities are made available to everybody. So talking about advocating for yourself, the first week you walked in the door at the Seidenberg School as a Seidenberg scholar, you informed me and Freddie Payne and a group of other people that you were the 17th best programmer in New York. And some of you are soon to be best friends said, "That's bullshit, Jose." But in hindsight, it turns out that you might have undersold yourself. You might have actually been 11 or 12.
That
So
was,
how
that
did
was
you how did
early.
how did you get that good? That's my first question is, how did you get that good? And what advice do you have for these folks about them getting good as well as a programmer?
I think like, so I was at Pace for a year, and I think I thought it was I thought it was hot shit. I really did. I was not. I was very far from it. And I think so I had an internship at Sun Microsystems, and that went well enough, right? Sun is no longer a business. That's not really my fault. That's Oracle purchased them years ago. But at the end of that internship, I realized that I really had no idea what I was doing software development wise. I really was still interested in it, but it was a very, very humbling experience. And I think that was like almost like an awakening, right? And I think everyone needs like kind of like a spark or something to like show them, hey, like this is whatever it is that you're doing, like you're at the bottom and you just have to keep learning, right? So that was my first awakening. And I think like a couple of years later, um, after having learned a couple frameworks and like really like started to dive into things, I had a conversation with a coworker of mine. I'd actually not a coworker, of my manager at the time, and I'd done some things software development wise. I pushed some bad code and like was kind of very nonchalant about it, and I was seen as a leader at the organization by that point. Just by virtue of my seniority there and the types of tasks that I worked on and the pull that I had with various folks at the organization. And so me kind of pushing that like bunk code into production and then going off and going to the bar and then being kind of like, haha, wasn't really a great look for me. So I had a conversation with my manager, and that was kind of like my second awakening. And I think like for a lot of people, you need like something that like kind of turns it on for you. And it's like, here's your spark. I need to go and I need to change something about what I'm doing. And I think those sparks are really important, right? If you've already had that awakening and you feel as though you're comfortable doing software development, great. You're at the first step, right? If there's something else that folks constantly, I don't want to say complain about you, but maybe point out and ingest, maybe say, hey, like you should change that. That's that's a potential for a second spark. But I think like that first spark, what is it that drives you? What is it that like makes you interested in programming? Why is it that you're doing this? I think that's very, very important. And if you don't have that, that's fine, right? You can be a very good software developer otherwise. I know a lot of people who just like they write code, that's not really their passion, but like it pays the bills. That's totally okay. But I do think that like if you want to be very dedicated and focused on it, having a point in time where you realize that maybe you're not hot shit, maybe you're not going to be the best programmer, because I fundamentally don't think that like anyone is the best at programming. There are things that you can be very good at, but maybe not the best at, right? There's always someone better at something than you. I think like having that like recognition of yourself and like where you're here, sky's the limit now. Now I can run, right? Where previously you were just walking to the starting line. I think that's super important.
Yeah, interesting. You're here in New York, living in Brooklyn. A lot of people in the tech industry are moving to Austin and moving to Miami. What do you think is going to happen with the New York scene tech in New York in the next 18 months?
It's going to be interesting. The vaccine and COVID has like, hopefully we'll push forward past that. I certainly work at a company that thinks we're going to push forward at that. If I don't, then there's no more live events. SeatGeek's kind of going out of business. That said, I don't think like New York is going away. I think a lot of the focus will change from some of the types of work that tech community was previously doing. Some of the like wealth generation that we were trying to perform, or like that was just like kind of going on, and focus a little bit more on. There'll be more of a focus on sort of the community and ways in which we can empower folks, right, to better themselves versus bettering like one portion of your life or enhancing your wealth. I think a lot of at least on the startup scene, that's been a major focus for the past, I don't know, decade. And in the past 3 years, we've seen a shift to companies that like focus more on charities or on bettering the lives of folks and the community in general. I don't know that necessarily means that we'll shift away from New York. New York's certainly very expensive to live in. I'm not gonna deny that. The price to live in New York has certainly decreased. I don't know what that will look like in a year. Hopefully still decreased, because I'd like to continue paying less in rent.
Best of
But
both worlds.
I think that the tech scene's not going away from New York by any means. It's just growing in other places, right? And which tech scene you choose, I think, is should be really driven by the kind of life you want to live. I love nice weather, but it's 95 degrees outside right now in Florida. I would melt into the sidewalk in the summertime. Likewise, in many other like large metropolitan areas, I need a car, and I don't really want to drive, right? I wouldn't. So that's that. LA is out, Austin is out. SF, there's too much walking, and there's a lot of hills. I'm not really built for that anymore. So again, I think a lot of like the tech scene in New York is not necessarily going to be driven by the exodus of people, and more driven by like what people are focusing now on, and which people have stayed. I think that's I don't think that's a bad thing by any means.
Yeah. And I want this to be more or less my last question. So I'm hoping that our fellow attendees will have some stuff for you, and I'm sure they will. But following on that line, there's always conjecture about the future. What the next technologies are going to be, what the next hot programming language is going to be. The advent of programless or programmerless development. You're in a fantastic position to see what's coming down the pike. So what's coming down the pike, and what should these guys be preparing for so that they can be successful at work?
Yeah, I think like when I was at Pace, the big hotness, the new hotness was Rails.
Right.
I think they had just released Rails 1. Goruko was the first year that was at Pace. We got free tickets, I think, for the.
Can I just share this one little story? There's a big Ruby on Rails community in New York, and they decided to host their conference at Pace. We were really excited, and they had an after party at that NoHo Hotel. It's called something else now, but the one that Robert De Niro owns. And so we go over there, and there's waitresses walking around with trays of Michelob, and I'm looking around at this with Jose and his colleagues. I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm going to get fired. That's something that happens to me a couple of times a week at Pace. But all these undergrad students and trays of cervezas go around. Jose had met some developers at the conference. He didn't take a beer. He took his MacBook, pulled out of his backpack, and went and sat cross-legged in a corner with some of these Rails guys, and they were sitting working on a project. So one of the truly proud moments of my life. But anyway, I digress. Please continue.
That was funny, because the guy, I can't remember what his name is right now, but he was the guy who maintains RDoc, which is the Ruby documentation system. It's like for everything. And this is super early on for Ruby, but he wanted some system to like navigate all the documentation. And he wanted like these scrollable drop downs. I was like, dude, you have like 1,000 classes in Ruby. This isn't going to work. He's like, no, I really want them. I'm like, okay, but like, it's not a good idea. And I was like, you should do it this way instead. And he was like, no, we're gonna do it this way. I think like a year or two later, I checked back in on like the Rails community because I was doing some other work at the time.
Yeah.
I checked back in and they were like, okay, they've gone back to the original suggestion I made. I was like, this is good, good, all right. I forget what your question was.
Oh, just about, the emerging technologies. What's coming down
Oh,
the pike, and
like Rails
what's hot that's not going to make it, and what hasn't anybody heard of that's going to be really huge.
Rails made it very easy for people to get started. I think that was super important. And I think a lot of communities after that have tried to replicate that. It's been really difficult. I think Node.js kind of brought that back again, for better or worse. They made a lot of decisions that make it easy for people to get started and build things. Laravel and PHP is another like very good example. I think in Laravel's case, they're very focused on making money. So a lot of community is just selling things to other people in the community, which is good, fine. Um, but I think like the focus over the next 10 or so years is going to be a lot of I think automation and making it easier for people to continue to get into the business. There's a mass expansion of folks who are starting as developers. Some of whom are not very good, right? I used to be a hiring manager at SeatGeek, and I would interview 20, 30 people a week. Um, and in many cases, folks honestly were not very good software developers, even despite having 10 years of experience. And I think that's like having the fundamentals is super important. I'm not talking necessarily like data structures and algorithms per se. You should know them, but like that, I'm not going to quiz you about like sets and lists
Hmm.
and matrices during my interview process. I'm going to ask you like real world programming problems, like how do you solve this and how do you think about these problems? I think like you should continue to focus on those things, but at the same time, think about like ways in which I think you can automate or better solve problems that you're already working on. I think like Salesforce is a good example of this. Salesforce is a like multi-billion-dollar company. They bought Heroku, I think like 10 years ago, and they just bought Slack, right, for like $1 billion, right? And a lot of their technology is focused around how do we make it easy for non-software developers to access a database, right, and set up a database and like model it and query it and display it in a way that makes sense for other people, right? They've been super successful and they've been successful forever, right? But there's a lot of other companies that are like, especially right now, coming up in this space. Airtable's one of them, Notion, that sort of thing. I think that's going to continue to be important, and that's more about accessibility of software, right? Accessibility of programming, not just to folks who are in software development, right? How do we make it easy for people to build applications by building new frameworks and tool chains, but also how do we expand that to non-software developers, right, on the business side? And then I think like, how do we expand technology in general to folks who maybe it's not as accessible for, right? I think like there's a lot of like hardware innovations that we can perform to make even just accessing your apartment easy for folks who are in wheelchairs, for instance, right? I think that's something that like we need to think about, and it's going to be super important over the next 10 years,
Hmm.
especially as we grow and we start to make a lot of these technologies more open and more available, um, with hopefully more and more oversight over how they're built.
Wow. That's really interesting stuff. And folks are here to hear a little bit about preparing for a tech interview, like they might have with you. And not everybody's going to be as forward thinking and understanding as you are. So if talked to a kid last week who had an interview coming up with Spotify and panicking because, oh my God, it's going to be a really tough interview. I'm going to have to be at the whiteboard and I'm going to have to know all this stuff and algorithms and data sets and what advice can you give about preparing for a tech interview, and how can they practice, and what should they not worry about as much?
If you're going after many of these like very large companies, fangs, if you will, they will like honestly, a lot of their recruiters, especially if they're reaching out to you, they'll try to guide you along through the process, and they'll give you materials and feedback on what it is that you should be looking at. I would say like very honestly, you should be like paying attention to what it is that they're saying. In Facebook's case, they send you a ton of literature. They send you a book that they like, hey, this is open, you can read it, whatever, blah, blah, blah. They send you a bunch of like links to stuff. And they make, I think like in some cases, they may make folks available for like mock interviews and that sort of thing. And I think like a lot of folks kind of, again, going back to thinking that you're all that, a lot of folks kind of breeze past that and are like, oh, I'll take, it'll be fine. This is not a big deal. And I think it's super important that you pay attention to any advice people are giving you in terms of like their own company and how they interview. I think there's a lot of startups out there that kind of take that same idea and they're like, yeah, we're the next Facebook. And so they require the same level of preparation. um, my gut says that like most of those are kind of nonsense. Like those
Mm.
startups just aren't going anywhere because their level of hiring is too high for where they're at, right? That's not to say that that's always the case, but certainly that is something to think about. And I think like as you progress farther and farther away from your university like experience, folks will expect more and more out of you, right? Because you've been in the industry for longer, right? So it'll be more and more difficult. I think yeah, at my company at least, we try to focus on, your problem solving skills, right? If we give you a problem, what do you think about it? How do you solve that problem? What are things that can break? Actually, my question is, you have a server, half your traffic is not reaching your website. This is how your server infrastructure is laid out. How do you debug this, right? And that's specifically for platform/infrastructure engineers. And I don't really care that they solve the problem because there's no correct answer. I can keep telling them that there's something else that's broken or that this isn't correct. I want to know how they react under pressure because 9 times out of 10, that person I'm hiring is also going to be someone who's on call on New Year's and is going to need to fix something under pressure so they can go back to drink, right? Or to celebrate or what have you, right? And I want to see how they think about problems, how they saw, how they request more information, how they proceed. At what point do they? I don't know. I don't want to say break, but like at what point do they stop solving a problem? I think that that's super important just to think about like how do you break something down and how do you approach issues, right? I think that's certainly important. You should continue working on your data structures and algorithm stuff. I'm not gonna lie, that's like if you can't reverse a string, most companies won't hire you because that'll be the first question that they ask you, right? If you don't know what a data structure is, you can probably get along just fine. I actually had an interview once where they wanted me to build a reverse Polish notation calculator, and I hadn't heard of that thing in like 15 years at that point. I think the last time I'd heard of one of these was my first computer programming class in high school. And I built one after they described it to me. I was like, oh, I think I know what this is, but I don't remember how I built one before because it'd been forever. I don't use these things. No one uses a reverse Polish notation calculator. And so I built one whiteboarded, right? And then they were like, we wouldn't build it that way. And I was like, what do you mean? They were like, you used an array and like, yeah. I was like, well, is there another way to do this? And they were like, yeah, you use it this way. I was like, yeah, I guess you could do it. That would be easier. Like not thinking about it, right? But I think like, for me, they wanted a problem solved. They didn't say that I had to use X. I asked them very clearly. I think that that's super important, making sure that like you understand what the requirements are. In their case, they were like, we have this problem, we want a solution, not we want a solution in this way, right? The other thing I would say is that if you don't know something, tell the interviewer that you don't know something or that you're not comfortable with X, right? Just be upfront about it. The two things can happen. One, they can be an asshole about it. And in which case, do you really want to work there? Probably not. Two, they can help you guide you along to the solution. You may not get the job, but at least you'll learn something. And there's still a likelihood that you'll get it because at this point you're saying you don't know X, right? The interviewer's job is to kind of understand where your knowledge stops, right? And what it is, like how you may progress in the future. Because at some point, if they end up hiring you, you work for them, hopefully in the best case forever, right? And you become a very successful employee at this company and a very crucial employee at the company. It's not important to them that right now you don't know how to do X because like whatever question they're asking you is almost certainly something that they've solved already. And if they haven't solved it, maybe and you're solving it for them, then that's a guaranteed hire. But they want to know what your growth will look like, right? So if you tell them I don't know X, but here's what I would try, they will help you solve the problem so you can get to the next part. Um, I think like that is super super critical because I've had folks who and attached to that, don't lie on your resume. I've had folks who say they know X, and then I'll just like throw out a softball question about that. No response, and I'm very, very clear on what that technology is. And if their level of knowledge is not even at like the beginning stages of a technology that they say that they're very proficient at, then that's going to be a problem, right? I'm hiring folks that I need to be able to trust in high intensity like situations. No one's dying per se, but I also don't need my coworker to lie to me when something's broken, right? So like being very truthful and honest about your experience and like what it is that you've done and how you've done it is important. Um, I think like even just getting into the interview, you maybe not lying is important, but certainly it doesn't mean that you can't. I don't want to say embellish. Embellish is probably the best word. You can't like stress or like the work that you've done enough and like show how you've done it, right? So I think some people might say I've worked with 10 people, maybe like in the context of working retail, I help customers solve problems, right? That's not really showing your next potential employer what it is that you do. I on average I help 100 customers a day like resolve X problem, right? That's a little bit more specific, and that shows your next employer, hey, this is the kind of thing that I can do, right? And then potentially some potential for your growth, right? So that's super important. Again, that's not, I'm not lying there, I'm not embellishing, I'm telling you the facts, but I'm also presenting it in a good light.
Yeah.
That's for the resume portion. And once you're in an interview, of course, don't lie about your skills. Don't put something on your resume that like doesn't, you obviously don't know or you're not familiar with. But be confident about whether or not you know something or not. Tell the employer that you know something or not. The other thing I would say here is that you should probably be upfront with any recruiters or hiring managers about your expectations for the job, right? The last thing anyone really wants is to hire someone or is to attempt to hire someone that they can't afford, right? Maybe your salary expectations are way off, right? And you think you're at X and they're actually here, like that's all they can afford, or that's all they think that that you're worth, or you think you're at X and they're over here, right? And in the best case, they'll move you up, but in the worst case, whatever. So I think, you know, be very forward about what their salary range is. Ask if they're not comfortable saying that, then maybe it's not worth your time interviewing with them, and vice versa. In their case, they may not want to go and spend 3 weeks of their lives interviewing you, and at the end, it's like you're not paying enough. We just wasted 3 weeks of interview time internally. So I think like having your expectations about both your compensation as well as what it is that you're going to be doing day to day is super important. I've had friends who they leave a job that they're comfortable with, but they leave for something else that like seems more lucrative or more interesting, and then they're suddenly working in a place that like this wasn't what they were hired for, right? And it's not that it's sometimes easy to come back to your previous job. Sometimes it's not very easy, right? And so you want to be very, very clear about what it is that you're jumping into, right? In some cases, you may, in small enough companies, you may be able to ask about, company finances. Please do if you can. It's very important because you don't want to go in and then all of a sudden they're laying off folks the first week, right? You might be on the chopping block. I think like knowing who it is that you're going to be working with, what that team looks like, what their goals are, what their aspirations are, like how important they are to the rest of the organization. That's super important. If they're not that important and they can be axed, that's what you just got hired into. Good luck. But if they are super important, they are critical. Are the right folks working on that team? Are those people that are folks that you can grow from, learn things from? I think that's super important, especially if you're a beginning software engineer, right? You may think you're super awesome. Probably, maybe you are. Probably not. 9 times out of 10. But you do want to have someone else you can bounce off ideas off at least. If everyone else on the team that you join is not as senior as you, and that's not what you signed up for, it's going to be really like a hindrance to your career. I think a lot of this is like about fact finding and information gathering. So you have to be, I think, very, very open to asking questions and answering them as well, because they're going to have ideally they're going to have questions for you. And that's how it's good. If they're asking you a ton of questions that are maybe not super related to the interview itself, you kind of have the job in the bag, and you can keep digging to see if that's a good fit for you.
My God, that's great information. And, it goes back to where we started in our conversation this afternoon, asking questions, advocating for yourself. And it's been wonderful, really, really wonderful. And to those of you on the call, a decade from now, we look forward to having you be in Jose's situation. And Jose's had a really amazing career. He's still a young guy and has so much to look forward to. And I hope you look at Jose and see someone who came through this school, this program, and has had a really big impact, and not just the work that he does professionally, but all the things that he gives to open source projects, the Cake PHP community, and other things. So he's involved in a lot, and he's influencing a lot of people, and he's back here helping us. So Jose, much love and thank you.
Thank you all.